Yeah, we are. Okay. So welcome everybody to part 1 of 6 of this virtual workshop series, Archiving 101, Fundamentals of Collection Management. We are really excited to get this off the ground. We're so excited at the amount of people who've registered for this. And hopefully this will be a good refresher or a good introduction wherever you are on the scale for that. So this, like I said, this is part 1 of a 6-part series. This is a program of the Oklahoma Archivists Association, which is an organization, if you're not a member or this is your first interaction with this organization, to promote networking and education for archives professionals, students, and record keepers in the state of Oklahoma. We do have other virtual workshops and presentations we've had over the past year and a half. Those are available on the Oklahoma Archivists Association website under resources. I think JJ will probably put something in the chat for that when she gets a second. And this series in particular is sponsored by the Oklahoma Department of Libraries, the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board, with funding from the National Historic Publications and Records Commission. We love doing programs with the ORAB office. One more thing I wanted to share with everybody while we're still letting people in is another program that's coming up for the Oklahoma Archivists Association. It is the Oklahoma Archives Bazaar. In the past, if you've ever participated or seen the Oklahoma Archives Bazaar, we've had that in person. This year it will be a virtual event. The goal of this event is to inform the public about archives in Oklahoma. And so this year, while it's going to be entirely online, archives from around Oklahoma are going to share information on recent and notable collections, as well as just general details about their organization. The theme this year is archives and popular culture. Submissions, if you have an archive that you would like to share in this virtual sort of exhibit space, can range from just a blog post about your collection or your organization, project summaries, pre-recorded videos, presentations, or virtual exhibits to showcase your work. And so the Archives Bazaar will start. It will launch October 2nd, which you still have time if you want to add something. But if nothing else, flag it in your mind to check it out after October 2nd. There's more information on the Oklahoma Archivists Association website. Now to today's workshop, Collecting with Purpose. We will be talking about collection policy, value of records, current appraisal theory. And today's session will be led by Nicole Willard. Nicole is the Assistant Director of the Max Chambers Library. She's been directing the archives and special collections there at the University of Central Oklahoma since 1995, and she took on the Library Advancement and Communications in 2011. So we're glad we got some of her time because all those things take up a lot of time. She's also managed the assessment in that library since 1998. Nicole has served 2 terms on the Oklahoma Historic Records Advisory Board as an Oklahoma Quality Examiner. She's also served on the Executive Committee for the Oklahoma Archivists Association on the very first Executive Committee for the Oklahoma Archivists Association, I should say, and has served as the chair of the Oklahoma State Archives and Records Commission. So without further ado, we welcome Nicole, and thank you for your time. And we're so glad all of you could join us.
Thank you. I appreciate that nice introduction, and welcome everybody. I appreciate you coming this afternoon. I know everybody's busy, so trying to take time to do these kinds of things isn't always easy. Let me share my screen here with you. And when we're done, somebody remind me to stop sharing my screen because I forget to do that sometimes. Here's my information, my email address and my phone number. I just want to say, if you all have any questions, either during the session or after the session, please feel free to email me or call me. I'm always happy to try and answer questions and assist whenever I can. So please feel free to reach out to me. So today we're going to talk about really selection and appraisal. And I really see these as the first functions of being an archivist. But a lot of people wonder, so, what do we collect and how do we collect it? So I'm hoping by the time we get to the end of this session, you have a better idea of how to answer those questions. And if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to ask. I think JJ's going to monitor the chat, so please feel free to put your question in the chat. So to answer what do we collect and how do we collect it, we're going to answer some questions. We're going to look at collection policies and how they affect collection decisions. We're going to look at how to appraise historical records based on their value. And we're going to also look at current appraisal theory, and I'm going to give you some examples to hopefully solidify it in your mind. First, I want to take a poll. Let's see if I can do this because this is kind of new for me. Because I really want to find out how many of you all actually have a collection policy. So does everybody see the poll? Okay, nobody's going to answer that. Okay, so everybody has, I see one vote here. Is everybody voting? I don't see anybody voting.
Because it won't let me. It just shared the results. I think.
Oh, I'm not seeing the results. Okay.
No, it's just sharing the results because I think because you did this as a test earlier,
okay.
It is.
So what are the results? Why don't you share them with me because I can't see them.
No. It's just the one vote.
Oh.
Is a test earlier. So.
Okay, let me see if I can relaunch it. Here we go. Let me see. There we go. Is that better?
I think that's going to be better.
There we go. There we go. Okay, sorry for the technical difficulty there.
We were too busy testing. We forgot to reset.
Now I know. Okay. So it looks like, we're still changing a little bit, but it looks like 60%, that's a good number of people have collection policies, and the rest either don't or they're not sure if they do. So this will be hopefully a good introduction for those who don't have one, and hopefully we're going to walk through the steps to help you build one. And if you already have one, this is probably a good review. It's a living document that should be reviewed periodically as things change in your organization. You want it to reflect the changes. So with that, I have one more poll here I want to ask. We know that 60% or about 60% of everybody has a collection policy. I want to know, of those 60%, how many of you have reviewed your policy recently or ever or never? Because sometimes that happens. We write policies and then we put them on the shelf and we don't look at them again.
I think while everyone's doing this poll, Nicole, I'm not sure if you wanted to share the screen that we're seeing is like your side by side.
Gotcha. I gotcha.
I think it's
there we go.
No, did you want it to be the last slide?
No.
Okay.
No.
You might want to stop sharing and reset your sharing.
That is not what I selected. Okay. But I saw that a good portion of you, almost 50%, have reviewed, and that's an impressive amount. Okay, let me stop and see what I'm doing wrong here. Sorry.
We're good.
This is the one I selected. Okay. Is that better?
Hold on a second. Yes.
I just turned on the show the PowerPoint, so I don't know what you all are looking at.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So carry on.
Okay. Thank you. So really that is an impressive number. Almost 50% of people reviewing their policies. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay. So what is a collection policy? Really, a collection policy is something that gives direction to the selection process. That sounds obvious, right? But these are really the three fundamental questions that we want to answer in a collection policy. What are we going to collect? How are we going to collect it? And how are we going to dispose of collections that are no longer valuable to our organization? And a lot of people think we don't weed in archives, but if you have been collecting for years without a collection policy, you probably have things in your repository that you may want to weed from your collection. Because once you develop a collection policy and then you start evaluating the materials that you have against it, you may find that there are items that really might fit better somewhere in some other collection, or just deaccession them, particularly when space becomes an issue. As a rule, archivists should only select and appraise materials that fall within the scope of your collection or acquisitions policy. And so if you don't have one, what organizations tend to do is just collect everything, and they accept everything. And that's okay if you've got tons and tons of space and tons of resources. But when you don't, you have to be selective. So a collection policy will help you keep within scope. You also want to keep in mind that your policy, you're going to want to align it with your organization's goals and mission, or your parent organization, whatever your case might be. And while these are the basic questions that a collection policy should answer, there are other reasons to have a collection policy. One is for continuity. If you have staff leave or you have organizational changes, it's really nice to have a policy that you can refer to keep everybody on the same page. And a policy not only guides your staff, but it also guides users and potential donors in letting them know what you are hoping to acquire, particularly donors. I probably get more calls about that than I do from sometimes researchers. People want to know what we will take.
Nicole,
Yeah.
we're still seeing your side to side with your
I don't
notes.
understand why that's happening.
I don't know what's going on either. I didn't know. I just didn't want you to not know. That's,
well, I didn't change anything.
now we just see a regular slide.
I don't know what's happening. That's really weird. Okay. Okay, so you might also want to have a collection policy to identify criteria for materials that you want to accept or materials that you can't accept. You also might want to have a collection policy to prevent collecting things that might also exist in another repository. Here in Edmond, we try to work with the Edmond Historical Society not to have a lot of overlap between what we collect, because we do collect about Edmond, as do they. So we try not to have a lot of overlap. You could also identify what sorts of formats that you can accept or that you can manage. And really, a collection policy has the benefit of focusing your resources in on specific areas. So if you don't have a collection policy and you've just been collecting stuff for years, how do you determine priorities in terms of processing those materials if one is not more important than another?
Nicole, we have a question in the chat.
Sure.
Somebody said, University Archives here, our scope has expanded to include rare, fragile library books in the past. Should this be added to our scope mission, or should we have a separate collection policy for them?
Well, probably what I would say is to check the policy of your parent organization. If you're an archives in a university library, rare books would probably perhaps be dealt with in that collection policy. So I'd probably check there first. Sometimes I know, like here, we keep they have taken valuable books out of our collection and we keep them in the archives just simply because we can secure them. And it's mainly so that they don't get removed from the stacks and not returned. But that doesn't mean that as an archives, we collect rare books, because we don't, but we do store them for the library as a whole, because we do have some rare books in the library as a whole. I hope that answered the question. But thank you. Okay. So moving on, before you start writing a collection policy, there's some things you might want to think about, because when you decide to accept records, you're really making a commitment to care for those records and provide access to them. And ethically, if you do not have the resources or the space to take proper care of a collection and provide access to it, ethically, you probably really should not accept that collection. So there are things that you want to think about to determine whether or not your repository could accept a collection, and some things that you want to think about before you write your collection policy, or that will inform your collection policy. And of course, finance is the big one. And this is if you have the funding to pay salaries, to pay for supplies, to buy tools and other items. And as I said, if you don't, then ethically, you probably should not accept collections. Space is another big one. If you have limited capacity to store materials, you're going to want to make note of that in your policy. You're going to want to set parameters for the size of collections that you can accept or that you can accommodate. You also want to identify what types of materials you want to care for. Of course, most programs that will collect historical records and papers, but you also might collect photographs or videos or audios, microfilm, magnetic or optical tape. There's lots of different formats, and these formats require often special storage or special kind of handling beyond that might be beyond the resource of your program. So if that's the case, you might decide not to take it because you really can't afford to manage audio, for example, or video, or make it available. You also want to consider whether or not you want to take materials in poor condition. We have been offered materials that are not in very good condition that have some value. But the real question to ask here is, can you afford to reformat? And can you afford to hire a specialist in conservation treatment? Because if you can't, then you probably shouldn't accept fragile or damaged materials. So we accepted a collection of artwork 3 years ago, and it was in poor condition, and we don't have any art conservators here on staff. So the donor kindly donated funding to help with the conservation treatment of the artwork. And that's always the best case scenario. You also want to make sure you have enough trained staff to manage the records. And here I'm not talking about processing, but I'm talking about, for example, if you decide to collect historical records, let's say of a foreign or a native language, or perhaps a really complex subject like maybe microbiology. So do you have the staff, whether they're volunteer or paid, that is able to understand the records and help users with the collection? So beyond just processing, you want to think about the content of the collection. And then one of the big things that I think people tend to forget is who are your users? Who uses your collection and what are their interests? If your users are mostly genealogists, then collecting scientific lab reports from a local business is probably not going to serve them very well. And this is really a very practical concern in a lot of historical records programs. We really need to be concerned with the need to collect materials that users want. And sometimes people just overlook that altogether. And I've also seen archives that will do needs assessments to determine what their users want. So I've seen it go both ways, but it is important to know what your users are looking for. And then, do you have any mandates? Some organizations have formal mandates to collect particular materials, and it can be about a specific geographic area or about an event or about a period. For example, the Oklahoma City Memorial is mandated to collect materials on the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. ODL is mandated to collect the records of state agencies. So if you have any mandates like this, you'll want to be sure to include them in your collection policy. So once you're aware of your goals and the resources that are ready at your availability, then you're ready to write up your collection policy. And you may want to, as I said, review your resources if you already have a collection policy. As we've seen with COVID, resources have changed rapidly. And so it might impact your collection policy. You may have had money to buy collections and now you don't. We've never had money to buy collections, but some lucky people are. So once you have all the information, and this is kind of basically what I had you all do in the handout, then you're ready to write your policy. And this is sort of these elements here are to provide a nice framework for developing your policy. And this basic, there are other elements you can add, but I would say these are the fewest things you want to include at least all of what's here. A name, you can name your organization, but you also want to remember to include the governing body, your parent organization, your purpose here. You want to align the mission of your parent organization or align with your own mission statement or your goals and aims that have been developed by your organization. Collecting emphasis. What do you want to collect? And I'm going to come back and take a closer look at this one here in a minute, because this is really sort of the crux of it all. You want to include what formats you accept. And as I said, for example, if you can't afford to migrate when technology changes, then you might think about not accepting digital records, as an example. You also want to think about your acquisition process. How are you going to accept collections? They can be accepted through donation, through purchase, through legal transfer, through mandate. So you'll want to identify how you acquire collections. And then the opposite of that, you'll want to identify how you remove collections or weed collections that are out of scope from your collection policy. And then lastly, you may not think that you will get this, but people will call and they'll want to ask you if you will loan materials, if you have material that's available and out there and they can find it. So you'll want to identify if you are going to loan materials, and if you are, who you will loan to and how that would look. So as I said earlier, a collection policy really is a living document that you should review and update on a pretty regular basis. And the goal here is to create a practical document based on realistic assessments of your program and the resources that you have available to you. So once you have your collection policy and you know what you are looking to collect, collecting emphasis, if you have a mandate, it can be really easy to determine what you collect, but if you don't, it can sometimes be the hardest question to answer. So you can look at these 3 questions and they might help you sort of focus in on an emphasis. You could look at what subjects, groups, or regions you want to collect. An example of that for the university for us, we collect, for example, groups. We collect the records of society groups, like we collect the records of the Daughters of the American Revolution Oklahoma chapter, as well as other, we call them society organizations, for lack of a better word. You also might think about what types of materials should your organization collect. And of course, this will be tied directly to your resources, because if you don't have server space or that technology or people to with that knowledge, you may not want to collect digital records. So you want to consider what types of materials that you want to collect. And most archives collect paper, but I know since I've been in my archives, we have been offered just about everything that you can think of. So it really helps to have a collection policy, because when you're offered those collections that might seem of value but don't really fit then you have your answer. You can kindly refuse to accept the collection by saying, I'm sorry, that doesn't fit within my collection policy. And then, of course, you want to know what your primary users want. And here is where you might consider doing a needs assessment of your audience. You know, maybe you put a little flyer, a little survey out on the counter of your organization and just asking. I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it, but it's important that you understand what your users are looking for so that you know, and it should be a part of deciding what you decide to collect. And then once you get your collection policy written, you definitely will want to make it public, put it out on a website or someplace where the public can see it, because it really is a statement of intent. It gives notice to the public that your repository intends to proactively develop holdings in a specific way. And so a lot of things can come from that. You know, users, researchers can find it and say, okay, they collect this. I'm going to contact them because I know they might have this. Or you might have somebody that is looking to donate a collection and they might find you. You might have an archivist who has acquired a collection that doesn't fit, and they might be looking for another home for that collection. And so if your collection development policy is in a public place where they can see it, they could perhaps find you and identify a new home for a collection that doesn't fit theirs. Okay, so once you get your collection policy written, then, and you know what you're trying to collect, then we start the collecting process, right? And so you might already have collections in your repository that need review. And for those of you who don't have collection policies, this is where you might see some weeding happening because collections don't fit the policy that you've established. The key function here of all of this is really appraisal, and how you appraise collections and the collections that you decide to bring in. Really, all other activities hinge on you being able to decide wisely what you collect, because really, you know, acquiring collections and processing them and writing expansive descriptions are wasted effort on collections that really have no enduring value. So you want to make sure that what you collect has value, and we determine that in the appraisal process. So we're going to look more at appraisal here. I do want to say that as an archivist, the materials that we review are unique. We're not looking at books that several libraries might hold. We're looking at unique, one-of-a-kind materials. And the decision about what you make to save and what you decide to ignore are irrevocable. Because if you decide to not keep something and throw it away, when it's gone, it's gone. Therefore, as an archivist, in a way, what we select is sort of an act of writing history. So you want to make sure what you collect is of enduring value. The proliferation of records and the creation of records, of course, has been staggering in the last few years. But originally, when the archives began, and of course, in the United States, our archives began later than most of those around the world. You know, it was an era of document scarcity. There were not a lot of documents that survived, so archivists tended to keep everything. So in that period, I would say they were considered more keepers than selectors. But today, we live in a world of document abundance, and we have an unprecedented mass of records. And so it's changed the role of archivists. If we look at the development of records just since the establishment of our country, you can see how prolific it's been. You know, from 1789 to 1925, 5 million records were created. That steadily grew to 30 million between 1930 and 1949, and then between 1950 and 1983, 130 million. By 2001, we were creating 360 million records a year, and that's only grown since. And to be mindful of this, NARA, or the National Archives, only actually keeps us at less than 1%. And these are statistics that are not definitive, because it's really kind of hard to come up with some of these answers. And Greg Bradshear, who is a senior archivist at the National Archives, has attempted to do this. But you know, the numbers are not exact. But he says that the National Archives keeps about 0.883% of all the government records produced in the course of a year. And while 1% might not seem like a lot, 1% of a billion is a lot. So they have to be very selective about what they keep. So really the role of an archivist is to create manageable historical records of value for the future. And so today we are required to select less and less from more and more. And I just see this growing, and as it grows, I think the role of an archivist will become greater and greater. So let's talk about appraisal, because this is how we determine whether a record is worth keeping or not, right? And so when I talk about appraisal here, I'm not talking about the monetary value of the record. I'm really talking about, does the record have sufficient value to justify continued retention and preservation? So, you know, nobody has infinite space. And with all these millions of records, we have to decide what we're going to keep and what we're not going to keep. And so we're talking about what has value for keeping of historical nature. Sorry about that. And I will add here that appraisal decisions are so difficult because all records have some conceivable value, right? So really the archivist's job becomes selecting those records that have sufficient value to justify the cost of their keeping. So I want to look at some values that we use when determining whether records should be kept or not. And I do want to say here that there really is no single textbook discussion or on appraisal or standard of practice. You know, there's a lot of best practices or agreed upon benchmark. There really is none. And it's because appraising is so unique. Every collection is unique, and every repository and its resources are unique. So it's really difficult to make sort of one best practice that would suit all of them, because each one is going to be different. It's a living procedure, and you as an archivist, as you're reviewing a collection for appraisal, are going to understand the nuances of situation and timing and cater those constraints to your organization's resources. So while I'm reviewing records or collections for possible acquisitions, I'm not only thinking about how much storage space do we have staff for processing, do we have the needed supplies, are the records in good condition, what format are they in, but I'm also considering, does this collection support other material in our collection? Is this material that our users are looking for? So all of these things are happening as you're reviewing these collections, which make it really difficult to create something that could be applied to every collection you appraise. So here are some of the criteria we use when appraising collections for selection. And remember, we have a collection policy, and when we're looking at a collection, we're probably only going to be looking at it or reviewing it because it fits within the scope of the collection policy that we've created. So all records have one of these values. All records start out with operating value, every single record. Not all records will have the remaining values, but some will. And so I want to look at these individually more closely. And I will say that as we move through these values, retention periods become longer, so that by the time we get to archival value, right, we're permanently keeping the records. So operating value, these are records that the organization currently uses, things that they do in the function of their business. For example, check vouchers have an operating value in paying bills and documenting payment, right? However, operating value is usually very short term, and once the operating need is over, then they really have no more value and they can be destroyed. So these are sort of what I consider transactional values, like paying bills. That's a transaction. And usually documents that fit within this scope have real short term, like maybe weeks. So unless you have a legal claim, or maybe you're having an audit, check vouchers can usually be destroyed within less than a year, as an example. Administrative value, after the records are no longer needed for current daily operations, they may still have some administrative value. Management may want to use them as a basis of a report, or perhaps maybe to write a speech. I've worked with several presidents in writing speeches using administrative records. And it can be difficult sometimes to judge administrative value since management can include a wide variety of individuals with different needs. And that certainly is the case here at the university. So mostly what we focus on is the leadership level of our organization. But in general, retention of administrative records have a value range of about 2 to 3 years. So it's a little bit longer than operating value, but probably not archival value. And a good example here of administrative value, or maybe technical manuals that you use to run technology. Once that technology is old and dated, you don't need those manuals anymore. They really don't have any more value. You can get rid of them. In administrative value, to give you some examples of the types of records that we're talking about, these are records that help identify how the organization carries out its responsibilities. So you might be looking at things like manuals, policies, directives, workflows, correspondence files, memos, reports, those kinds of things. Then we have fiscal value, and usually fiscal records are kept as an audit trail to document financial transactions. And it's usually agencies like the IRS who determine how long these records have to be kept. And usually these are also short retention period. And they can also usually be destroyed after any audits have been satisfied. So these are records that we're not going to keep, not going to have archival value. And I have an example here. This is from the State General Records Disposition Schedule. This is the schedule that state agencies follow. And you can see here that it describes what the record is, and then it describes how long you have to keep it or when it can be destroyed. In this case, we're talking about maintenance and insurance files. These are wages and how much their salaries and how much was deducted for insurance and that sort of thing. And according to our state schedule, we only need to keep those for a year or until all audits have been satisfied. When we look at legal value, we're really talking about two distinct things here. An organization may be required to, by statute or by regulation, to retain certain records for specific periods. For an example, unemployment compensation cases or employee incident reports, those sort of things. And those would be determined by state regulation or by statute. And then the other type of legal record we have then are records that document rights of interest. So for a corporate body, we might be looking at things like patents or trademark files. For individuals, we would probably be looking at things like contracts or leases or deeds or vital statistic records like birth, death, marriage records. We also might be talking about things like wills or trusts, anything that would protect your interest. And here's an example, another example from the records disposition schedule for patent files. It describes what it is. And then obviously the state believes these have archival value because after 2 years in the office, they can be transferred for permanent preservation in the state archives. Now, this is a general disposition schedule for the state that's written by, actually, ODL handles this, and this is Jan Davis that works with agencies, helping them to write these. But these also can be adapted for any private organization. And if you have a schedule like this and you ever end up in legal trouble and they want to see your records, if you've destroyed them, they'll want to see your schedule. They'll want to see how you destroyed them. And if you have a process for destroying them, they want to know that you just didn't go in and destroy them because they're going to come in and try and audit those records. So then we come to archival value, and records worthy of permanent preservation for reference and research purposes are selected to be deposited into an archive or repository. These are also sometimes referred to as historical records of historical value or continuing value or research value or enduring value. In other words, permanent value. These are records that have either research value because we have scholars who are wanting to study them. Researchers like to extend human knowledge and they want to use basic historical evidence. And these records that you preserve may provide that information for them, information about individuals or information about corporate bodies, information about their problems, their conditions, in any number of things. The organization that collects their own archives, like here at the university, our archives provides continuity and consistency for the organization over time. So like, for example, if when we have a new president, which we don't do annually and don't do really frequently, but when we do, we usually have an inauguration, and that's the first thing the inauguration committee does is they call me and they want to know, what have we done in the past and what did it look like? And because we have those records, I can share that with them. But it does provide a consistency and a continuity for our actions. It can also prevent duplication of efforts, because if we've done something once, we want to keep record of that so we don't have to do it again. And of course, it protects our legal rights, having archival records. So when we talk about appraisal theory in the United States, and of course, appraisal theory, I'm sure, has existed since antiquity, but modern appraisal theory really starts with Theodore Schellenberg. He was a staff member of the National Archives, and he wrote extensively on appraising and appraisal value, particularly the concept of evidential and informational value, and really made it the core of U.S. appraisal theory. He really influenced a whole generation of archivists. And since then, other archivists and authors have further refined the elements of Schellenberger's theory and applied them to new situations and types of records that did not exist when Schellenberg was alive. So we need to understand what did he mean by evidential and what did he mean by informational value. So by referring to items with evidential value, Schellenberger was really talking about records that are necessary to document an organization's functions and the organization itself. The origin of each entity, I like to kind of think of as the metadata of the organization. You know, these are going to be records like charters or articles of incorporation, those kinds of things that document the establishment of an organization. It might establish why the organization was created, what led to the creation of the organization. On the other hand, substantive programs of each entity includes information about the major programs of an organization. They might include things like summary narrative accounts, policy documents, publications or publicity materials, internal management records, anything that tells us really how that organization functioned. And then we have, with the informational value, the other side of this, he kind of shifts the appraisal emphasis here. And instead of focusing on evidence about the organization itself, the archivist now wants to consider the content of the records and what light they might shed on people within the organization or things within the organization or events within the organization. And, you know, I'm going to use my organization as an example again. When I look at people in our organization, of course, I'm looking at our university presidents, our provost, our other VPs. And when I look at things, these can be buildings, they can be objects. On our campus, I would probably identify Old North as one of those things. So anything related to Old North, we keep in our archives. And events, you know, these are the interactions between people and things. And so in my organization, those are going to be things like graduations and convocations and sporting events and theater productions. So these are things that tell us information about our organization. So we're going to want to keep them for archival value. And sometimes it's hard to determine informational value. So these are three things that I like to consider when I'm sort of making that decision test. I ask myself, is it unique? I want to know if the information is duplicated elsewhere. Also, is the information intellectually duplicated elsewhere? I also want to know, is it the most complete version of information? And is it presented in a summarized way and here or maybe perhaps somewhere else? I'm also looking at the form, the physical condition. If it's in poor condition, you know, that would give me pause. I'd have to reflect on resources and what it might take to keep it. Also, I'm going to be looking at volume, because if I'm looking at 100 cubic feet of records and maybe 5 cubic feet of those records are really important, am I going to want to keep the collection? I want a good research, a high research ratio to value or volume of records. And then important, how important is the information? And here you're looking at how important are the the people, the places, and the events that are dealt with in the records. And are they likely to be the subject of future research? I mean, that is one thing as an archivist, having been an archivist for 30 years, that I've realized I'm way different from most people because I'm always thinking 100 years ahead. What are people going to want 100 years from now? What are people going to be looking to research? Because that's what I'm looking to save today, what they're going to be wanting to see 100 years from now. So now that we have covered the sort of criteria, the different values that we look at, I kind of like to look at some examples just really quickly to maybe help understand the differences here. So on the left here, we have different record series, and these are record series that we deal with in our archival records that come from different entities on our campus. So if you look at employee time cards, while these are definitely evidence of how we pay checks and how we receive things, really they don't have any informational value unless there's a famous person. If you have the time card of Steve Jobs, that might be something you want to keep. But otherwise, they are not going to have any archival value, so we're not going to keep them. Minutes from the Board of Trustees, that has definitely got evidential value about key decisions and actions. It might have informational value about key people, but we are definitely going to want to keep these and preserve them because they tell us evidence about the organization. Curriculum files from our academic affairs vice president. These are definitely records that document how curriculum has developed over the years on our campus and our curriculum process. There might be some informational value with them, but that's not the reason that we would retain them, but they definitely have archival evidential value. We have a university bookstore. They have annual reports, and while they provide evidence of bookstore operation, they're really not worth preserving. They don't have any informational value. And when space is at a premium, we have other records that take higher priority. And then the last one I throw in there because library circulation records may have both informational and evidential value, but we are never going to keep them because of privacy concerns. So there might be legal reasons why you don't keep records. If there are privacy concerns, then we know this is a collection I'm never going to be able to open up to researchers. And if I'm never going to be able to open up a collection to researchers, why would I keep it? Why would I let it take up valuable storage space? Okay. So with the 5 values identified, operational, administrative, fiscal, legal, and archival, you can kind of get an idea here of their value and then what we keep and don't keep. Check vouchers, we've already identified, they have no archival value, except if it's a prominent person. Press releases, we know they have evidential probably and informational value. So we're going to keep those. Again, employee personnel files, while they may have operating, administrative, and legal value, we're not going to keep them again because they're too confidential to open. And if we're not going to open them, then we're not going to take them. That's sort of one of the first responsibilities of an archives. One last thing I want to cover real quickly before we get to the end here is intrinsic value. This is a terminology that archivists have used to describe materials that should be retained because of their physical properties. And this can be either the actual physical property and the information that's recorded on it, or it can be the content itself. And this was kind of a difficult one. So in the 1980s, the National Archives established a committee to determine the characteristics and qualities for intrinsic value. And in 1982, they filed their report. And of course, they wanted, the challenge here was to create a document that could be used even in unforeseen circumstances. So they were trying to write a document that would even address future needs. And so what they came up with was these 9 characteristics. As I said, the study was published in 1982. And if something in your archives has any one of these 9 characteristics, you're going to want to keep the original form and not duplicate it and get rid of the original. And this is a big deal for the archives, the National Archives, because for the most part, unless the National Archives has material that has intrinsic value, they copy everything and destroy originals. I know that sounds almost sacrilegious for archivists, but they, with the sheer number of records that they deal with, they cannot keep everything physically. So they duplicate things electronically and destroy originals unless they have intrinsic value, which made it really important for them to establish these characteristics back in the 1980s. And you may or may not have some of these in your collection. We have lots that fit under the aesthetic or artistic quality. We have lots of artwork, sketches, photographs. We have glass plate negatives in our collection. And of course, we don't get rid of those. Just looking down this list here, we probably have some things that we keep just to put on exhibit. We do have legal documents in our repository. So anything that's got a signature on it that is evidential or informational is probably something you're going to keep the original. So that brings me to the end of values. And so really quickly, I just wanted to go over the handout that I sent for those of you who had time to look at it. And I'm going to do a poll here real quick for each one because I want to know what you all decided. So I had asked you with the handout to really kind of write a collection policy based on the information I gave you, and then evaluate the 4 different groups to determine whether or not, based on the policy you wrote, if you should collect, if you should accept the collection or not. So let me close that poll. I can get back to my polls here. And we're going to look first at the Sailing Association. I don't know why it's,
And Nicole, just to let you know, we have only just like a few minutes till.
yeah, this shouldn't take long. So the Sailing Association records, this is a voluntary association of people interested in boating. So how many of you thought we should accept this collection? Ooh, about a 50. So we're getting, so we probably have a majority of people who say we should accept it. And I agree, this is the collection we should accept. These records document people in the area, and they would be a particularly good fit if the information related to the environment, since that's what they want to collect. Okay, what about the next records group was the Oak Island Environmental Coalition. Let me pull that poll up here. I want to see what you all thought. Oops, I thought about that one. They had 10 cubic feet of records from 1975 to 1983 concerning the preservation of local wetlands. This one definitely is a yes. It looks like everybody was of the same opinion, but these records definitely meet the criteria of the collection policy very well. They document the local wetland preservation efforts, which is exactly what the archives has said they want to do. All right, what about the Oak Island Bakery records? Let me pull that poll up here. Let's see how many of you thought that one should be kept. This one was a little bit probably more difficult to decide. So it'll be interesting to see what y'all thought. So we got about a 50-50 split here almost, 56 to 44%. Okay, now we're going up a little bit more. So this is kind of a tough one. This is a good example of an interesting and important local history collection. And it certainly documents the local people, but it does not have content related to wetlands or environment. So if I was looking at this collection, probably the decision I would make here would probably be try to find another program where the collection would be a better fit. However, if I was not able to find another program, I might decide to accept the collection even without a perfect fit, just because it's important. And you might decide that your program doesn't have the resources to care for the collection. So this is one of those ones that where you would have to it would have to be based on your capabilities, the resources of your organization. So again, here is that nuance of appraising. And then lastly, the Library Association records. Let me pull that poll up here and see what y'all thought. That's the untitled poll. Here we go. So this is a local, I didn't mean to say library, I meant to say literary association, local library authors and teachers. This is another one that was probably a little bit more difficult. This is interesting to see the results here. Kind of a split the opposite of the last one. So with this one, this collection too is an interesting local history collection that documents local people, but without a focus on the environment. And it also contains audio tapes, and the program has specifically said they will not support. So I think the best decision in this case would probably be to find another program that might accept the records, and because you simply cannot care for the audio tapes, I probably would not take that collection, but it would be hard to not. I mean, you definitely want to find another home for it. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, only 2 minutes after. If somebody hadn't asked a question, I'd have been right on time. But again, this is my contact information. If you all have further questions, or maybe you have something specific that I might be able to help you with, I'm sure happy to assist when I can.
Thank you so much, Nicole. This was great. Oh my goodness, it's so much information, but you really condensed it well.
It's a lot of
I suspect you have a few more minutes if people do have questions, if they want to stick around for 5 minutes, or just write down your contact information. We did have a question whether we could share your slides.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
If you get those to me, I will send them out to everybody that registered today. And we will post the recording for this later soon.
Oh, I need to stop sharing my screen, don't I see?
I was just going to say,
yeah. There we go.
So at this point, I will let you all decide if there's anything to linger or if people just want to follow up directly. But also for you all, don't forget, we have another one of these, the part 2, next Thursday at the same time, same place. We make it easy. And that will be focused on bringing in new collections, and that will be led by Jennifer Green, who actually was here, maybe still here somewhere today, which will focus a lot on more on provenance, physical custody, and intellectual control. So it's that next step. So.
We do have a question that came in. They're a public library with a really small archive, and they have a ton of school records from small public schools in the area that no longer exist. We don't have room for all of these records, even though they are unique and relevant to our area. When and how do we decide to find another organization to send these to?
I would first probably try to find a parent organization for the schools. I don't know if they have most have some sort of superintendency, to see if they have any desire for the records. And then if there isn't a organization that might above them, a parent organization that might take them, then I would probably call the State Historical Society There used to be an organization, I think it's defunct now, but they collected school records like this. So I would say if you have a collection policy, you could definitely deaccession the records based on your collection policy because they may no longer fit. And if you don't have the room for them, I would definitely probably try to find another fit for them somewhere else. However, you know, when you take collections, a lot of times, not all of the collection is worthy of keeping. And we didn't really go into this, and maybe Jennifer will probably touch on some of this. But when you actually accepted a collection, you know, we kind of do triage on it, you know, what you will keep, what you will not keep, and then what you will keep and deal with at a later time. Sort of like almost medical triage, right? Who needs surgery right now, who is not going to live, and who can wait, right? Kind of the same thing here. So you might take that collection and sort of put it through a triage and see if you can't reduce the size of it before you maybe try to find another home for it. And sometimes when you do that, you might realize that you're only going to keep maybe 10% of what you have if you look at it based on some of the values that we talked about today. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, well, Sarah had to dash out to another meeting, but we just want to thank everybody again for coming. And Nicole, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I'm going to stop recording. And again, Nicole provided her contact information. We put that in the chat as well. And then this recording and the slides will be distributed and posted on the website. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and we hope to see you next Thursday.
Thank you, everybody.